Richard Speck's story begins, not with bloodshed, but with something just as chilling: neglect, abuse, and a slow descent into hatred. Born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, Richard Benjamin Speck was the seventh of 8 children. His early life was shaped by instability, though his mother, Mary Speck, was a deeply religious woman who did her best to raise her children in the church. Tragedy struck the family early, when Richard's father passed away from a heart attack. In 1947, at only 6 years old, Speck lost the one figure who provided him with any structure or emotional warmth. Mary soon remarried a man named Carl Lindbergh, an insurance salesman with a violent temper and an affinity for alcohol. Carl showed no interest in bonding with Richard or his siblings. Instead, he took out his anger on them, and Richard, already fragile and sensitive, bore the brunt of the abuse. In his stepfather's eyes, Richard was weak, a boy who couldn't measure up to his rigid standards of masculinity. As Speck entered adolescence, he withdrew further into himself, alienated from both his family and peers. School was no refuge. Teachers noted his lack of concentration, defiance, and social awkwardness. Richard was small for his age and often targeted by bullies. He began drinking heavily at just 12 years old, finding in alcohol both an escape and a weapon. By the time he reached 8th grade, he had dropped out entirely. What followed was a chain reaction of poor decisions, each more dangerous than the last. Throughout his teenage years, Speck's criminal record grew rapidly. His first arrest was for trespassing, followed by a slew of minor offenses, shoplifting, and disorderly conduct. But soon, the crimes became more aggressive. He was arrested multiple times for burglary and assault, and though these infractions would land most people in serious legal trouble, Speck was often let off with light sentences. The system at the time seemed unprepared or unwilling to deal with someone like him. By his early 20s, Speck was drifting between jobs and cities. He married a 15-year-old girl named Shirley Malone, with whom he had a daughter. The marriage was short-lived and violent. Shirley would later testify that Richard beat her regularly, especially when drunk, and was both sexually aggressive and controlling. She left him within a year, taking their child with her. This failed marriage only deepened his rage and sense of abandonment. After the breakup, Speck's life spiraled further into chaos. He moved between Illinois and Texas, picking up odd jobs as a laborer, carpenter, and dock worker, never staying long before getting fired or walking away. In each place, he left a trail of police records, failed relationships, and rumors of aggression. By 1966, he was wanted in Texas for assaulting a bartender with a knife and suspected in the attempted rape of a woman in a hotel room. Rather than face arrest, Speck fled north to Chicago to live with his sister, Martha. She, like others before her, believed Richard just needed a fresh start. But what she didn't know was that her brother's anger was metastasizing into something monstrous. In Chicago, Speck drifted aimlessly, jobless, drinking daily, and harboring a growing hatred toward women. He often spoke bitterly about his ex-wife, and blamed women in general for his failures. He began stalking them, watching from across the street, following them on buses, fantasizing about dominance. His violence was no longer reactive. It was becoming premeditated. Despite his erratic behavior, the people around Speck seemed oblivious to the danger. He wore a mask of calm. Friends described him as quiet, almost polite, though with a dark sense of humor and a tendency to snap under pressure. But behind the soft voice and unassuming posture, Richard Speck was a volcano building pressure, and it was only a matter of time before he erupted. In the spring of 1966, Speck attempted to get a job on a merchant ship through the U.S. Coast Guard's National Maritime Union, but was rejected due to his criminal record. This final humiliation crushed whatever restraint he had left. Feeling cornered, rejected, and invisible, Speck began planning his ultimate act of revenge, not against a single person, but against an entire gender he had come to despise. All the pieces were in place. A lifetime of abuse, a failed marriage, rejection, mental instability, and a deeply ingrained hatred for women had forged Richard Speck into something beyond a criminal. He had become a ticking time bomb, and when it finally exploded, the city of Chicago and the entire nation would be left gasping in horror. It was a warm, humid night in Chicago on July 13th, 1966, and most of the city was settling into a peaceful summer slumber. But in a modest brick townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street, a nightmare was about to unfold, one that would send shockwaves through the nation and etch Richard Speck's name into the annals of true crime forever. The townhouse served as a dormitory for student nurses attending the South Chicago Community Hospital. Inside were 9 young women, bright, ambitious, and full of hope. They were dedicated to helping others, spending their days in classrooms and their nights studying together. These women shared not just a home, but a sisterhood. None of them could have imagined the horror that was about to breach their sanctuary. Around 11 p.m., Richard Speck arrived in the neighborhood, dressed in black and armed with a knife. He had been drinking heavily and was high on drugs. He had spent the day drifting through bars and alleyways, working up the courage to do what he had been obsessing over for weeks. Earlier that evening, he had tried unsuccessfully to break into other homes, but fate or misfortune brought him to the nurse's townhouse. He forced open a screen door and quietly slipped inside. The women were just preparing for bed. Some were brushing their teeth, others chatting in their rooms. At first, they thought it was a burglary. They complied when Speck ordered them into one room. He told them he just needed money and would leave soon. But as time passed and he made no move to leave, a dreadful realization began to dawn. This wasn't a simple robbery. This man was here for something far more sinister. One by one, Speck tied the women's hands behind their backs, using torn bed sheets and clothing. He seemed calm, almost methodical. His soft voice and measured movements gave the impression of control. He reassured them, told them they wouldn't be hurt. But this was a calculated deception meant to keep them compliant. It worked at least at first. What followed was a systematic, calculated massacre that would last for hours. Over the course of the night, Speck led the women out of the room one at a time. He would take them into another bedroom or the bathroom, then he raped them, strangled them, or stabbed them to death. Each time he returned, the number of women in the room was smaller. Terror gripped those who remained, but they were too afraid to scream or flee. Speck's presence was like a shadow, always looming, always unpredictable. One of the women, 23-year-old Corazon Amaro, managed to survive by hiding under a bed. Terrified and trembling, she remained silent as she listened to the muffled cries and the sounds of her friends being slaughtered. She stayed there for hours, even after Speck left, too scared to move until daylight began to pour through the windows. Speck's killing spree took the lives of 8 young women: Pamela Wilkening, Gloria Davy, Suzanne Ferris, Marianne Jordan, Merlita Gargulo, Nina Schmale, Patricia Matusek, and Valentina Pajoun. Each was murdered in cold blood. Their dreams, their futures, snuffed out by a man who felt the world had wronged him. When Corazon finally emerged from her hiding place and stumbled into the street the next morning, she was hysterical. She flagged down a neighbor and led police to the scene. What they found inside was like something out of a horror film. Bodies were sprawled across bedrooms and hallways. Blood stained the walls and floors. The townhouse, once a home of hope and ambition, had become a slaughterhouse. The city of Chicago reeled in disbelief. The sheer brutality of the crime, coupled with the youth and innocence of the victims, triggered a media frenzy. Newspapers printed the women's faces side by side, mourning their loss. The public demanded justice. The mayor called for a manhunt. Investigators had little to go on. Speck had wiped down the scene carefully. But Corazon's eyewitness account was crucial. She described him in detail: his pockmarked face, his tattoo that read "Born to Raise Hell," and his southern accent. Her courage in the face of unimaginable trauma would become one of the most powerful elements of the case. As the city locked its doors and parents clutched their daughters a little tighter, Richard Speck vanished into the shadows. For 3 long days, he roamed the streets of Chicago, sleeping in abandoned buildings, drinking heavily, and reading the newspaper headlines about the manhunt for himself. Eventually, overcome by guilt or, perhaps fear, he slashed his wrists in a hotel room in a suicide attempt. The front desk clerk found him and called for help. At the hospital, a doctor recognized his tattoo from the newspaper description and alerted police. Just like that, the monster had a name and a face. Richard Speck was taken into custody without resistance. He said little at first, but his eyes betrayed him empty, cold, unreadable. The media dubbed him the Mad Butcher of Chicago. But for the families of the 8 murdered women, he was something far worse. He was the end of everything their daughters had hoped to become. Richard Speck's arrest marked the end of a citywide manhunt, but it was only the beginning of one of the most emotionally charged trials in American history. The man who had taken 8 young lives in a single night was now under the microscope of the public, the press, and the justice system. His face, with its expressionless stare and pockmarked skin, was plastered across every newspaper in the country. But beneath the surface of media sensationalism, a legal storm was brewing, one that would raise complex questions about justice, punishment, and the true nature of evil. Following his arrest on July 17, 1966, Speck was taken to Cook County Jail. His initial demeanor was cold and reserved. He refused to speak, often staring blankly at the walls or avoiding eye contact with investigators. Police interrogated him for hours, but he remained tight-lipped. It wasn't until they brought in Corazon, a Muraltha, lone survivor of his massacre, that things began to unravel. Corazon's identification of Speck was immediate and absolute. She pointed to the tattoo, "Born to Raise Hell," and declared, without hesitation, that he was the man who had slaughtered her friends. That testimony would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It was chilling, courageous, and unforgettable for many watching the case unfold. Corazon was not just a witness, she was a hero. The state charged Speck with 8 counts of first-degree murder. He was appointed public defenders, but the challenge was enormous. The evidence, while largely circumstantial due to Speck's careful cleanup of the crime scene, was strengthened by Corazon's eyewitness account and a confession he made to a doctor while heavily sedated. In a groggy state, Speck reportedly mumbled, "It just wasn't their night," and described details of the crime that had not been released to the public. His trial began in April 1967 and was held in Peoria, Illinois, far from the emotional frenzy of Chicago. Defense attorneys attempted to argue that Speck had been intoxicated and under the influence of drugs during the murders, and therefore incapable of premeditated intent. They also introduced testimony suggesting that Speck suffered from brain damage and a troubled upbringing, hoping to paint him as a mentally unstable man rather than a calculated killer. But the prosecution would not be swayed. They methodically outlined the events of the night, relied on Corazon's harrowing testimony, and brought forth evidence that Speck had been planning the crime in the days before, carrying a knife, casing potential targets, and rehearsing how to control multiple victims. The jury sat in stunned silence as the horror was relived detail by detail. Throughout the trial, Speck remained disturbingly calm. He often looked bored, uninterested, or even sleepy. He showed no emotion as the names of the victims were read aloud. No remorse, no sadness. Too many watching. It was further proof that they weren't dealing with an ordinary man. They were looking into the eyes of a predator. After just 49 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. On June 5, 1967, Richard Speck was sentenced to death in the electric chair. The courtroom erupted in relief. Families of the victims cried, hugged, and clung to the hope that justice had finally been served. But Speck's time on death row would not be short. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Furman v. Georgia that the death penalty, as applied at the time, was unconstitutional. As a result, Speck's sentence was commuted to life in prison. For the families, it was a crushing blow. The man, who had taken everything from them, would now spend the rest of his life in a cell alive. Speck was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, where he would remain for the next 19 years. Life behind bars, however, did not bring reflection or repentance. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Speck became notorious within the prison for manipulating guards, trading drugs, and involving himself in the underground economy of the incarcerated. Rumors swirled that Speck had taken on lovers, was receiving special treatment, and even underwent hormone therapy to grow breasts, though these claims wouldn't be confirmed until years later. For now, he was just another inmate, but one with a chilling past and a disturbing charisma that seemed to allow him to navigate prison politics with ease. Over the years, journalists and documentarians requested interviews, but Speck refused. Most of them, when he did speak, it was with a flippant, mocking tone. "I had no help," he once said, in a letter. "No one ever helped me when I needed it, so don't expect me to care now." Despite being locked away, Speck's story continued to haunt the public imagination. True crime books, films, and news specials retold the events of July 1966 with morbid fascination. People wanted to understand him, to unravel what made someone like Richard Speck capable of such evil. But understanding would prove elusive. For many, the most disturbing part wasn't just what he did, it was how little he seemed to care. By the 1980s, Speck had faded from headlines, becoming more of a ghost than a man. But what would emerge later would reignite the fury of a nation, revealing that even behind bars, Speck's capacity to horrify was far from over. By the mid-1980s, Richard Speck had become just another inmate, at least on paper. He had been serving his life sentence at Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet, Illinois, for nearly 2 decades. To the outside world, he was largely forgotten, a remnant of a bygone era of true crime. But within the prison walls, something deeply unsettling was happening. Speck was undergoing a transformation, one that would shock the nation when it was finally revealed. Prison life for Speck was not what most people imagined. Rather than enduring constant threats or punishment, he adapted quickly to the underground world of the penitentiary. Charismatic, manipulative, and utterly devoid of remorse, Speck knew how to play the system. He built relationships with other inmates and, more disturbingly, with prison guards who turned a blind eye to his activities. As the years went by, Speck began experimenting with drugs smuggled into the facility. He developed connections with the prison's illicit drug trade, trading favors, sex, and influence for cocaine, pills, and heroin. He wasn't just a user, he was a dealer. By the late 1980s, he had grown bolder. He no longer tried to hide his addictions or his increasingly bizarre behavior. That's when the transformation began. Somewhere along the line, Speck began taking hormone pills, estrogen reportedly, to grow breasts and alter his appearance. He let his hair grow longer, wore panties beneath his prison uniform, and adopted a more feminine persona within the cell blocks. Inmates began referring to him not just as Richard, but sometimes by female nicknames. He traded sexual favors for protection and access to drugs, presenting himself as submissive to powerful inmates while using his notoriety as leverage. It's unclear whether this change was driven by a genuine desire to embrace a new identity or purely as a survival strategy. But what is clear is that Speck relished the control he had regained. Even in prison, he found a way to be dominant, to become an object of fascination, disgust, and twisted desire. He once reportedly said, "If they can't kill me, they'll have to live with me." All of this remained hidden from the public until 1996. 5 years after Speck's death, when a bombshell video was leaked to the press, recorded secretly by inmates in 1988. The footage showed a very different Richard Speck, one that the world had never seen. In the grainy footage, Speck can be seen snorting cocaine, engaging in sexual acts with fellow inmates, and flaunting his surgically enhanced chest. He wore blue silk panties, strutted around the cell with exaggerated feminine gestures, and spoke openly about his crimes. When asked if he felt any remorse, he laughed and said, "I had no feelings at all that night. They're dead, that's it." The tapes were horrifying, not just for their graphic content, but for what they revealed about the prison system itself. Here was a convicted mass murderer, living a life of indulgence behind bars, taunting the world with his complete lack of regret. Worse still, the videos suggested that prison guards had either enabled or ignored the behavior. Public outrage was immediate and explosive. Families of the victims were blindsided. They had imagined Speck wasting away in a cell, tormented by guilt. Instead, they were confronted with images of a man who had not only escaped punishment, but appeared to thrive in captivity. Illinois lawmakers demanded answers. Investigations were launched into the Department of Corrections. The tapes became evidence of a broken system, one in which a murderer could reinvent himself, indulge his vices, and become a grotesque symbol of failure. The press labeled him the shame monster of Stateville, a title that blended both horror and fascination. For some, Speck's gender transformation was a desperate attempt to avoid rape and violence, some evolution shaped by the brutality of prison life. Others believed it was a final, grotesque extension of his narcissism, his ability to reshape himself to survive, manipulate, and dominate, even from a cage. Psychologists weighed in, debating whether Speck's transformation was sincere or strategic. One forensic expert noted, "For someone like Speck, identity is a tool. He was never truly male or female, he was always a predator. He simply used what he had to maintain control." Whatever the truth, the damage was done. The leaked footage cemented Speck's legacy not as a remorseful prisoner, but as a chilling reminder of how evil can adapt and endure. Even decades after his crimes, Richard Speck had found a way to traumatize the public once more. He had become a phantom of America's justice, system proof that the nightmare didn't end with bars. The final twist in the saga of Richard Speck wasn't just the murders, but the revelation that a man who committed unspeakable crimes had lived out his sentence with laughter, lust, and power. For the families of the victims, it was a second betrayal. For the nation, it was a haunting lesson. Monsters don't always die. Sometimes, they evolve. By the early 1990s, Richard Speck was no longer a name on the front pages of newspapers or the focus of nightly newscasts. Time had dulled the edge of his notoriety for the general public, but to those who had lived through the terror of July 1966, his name still invoked pure horror. For the families of the 8 murdered student nurses, his continued existence was a cruel reminder that justice had not truly been served. He remained in prison, yes, but alive, breathing, and, as later evidence would show, indulging in a lifestyle more indulgent than punitive. On December 5, 1991, just one day before his 50th birthday, Richard Speck collapsed in his cell at Stateville Correctional Center. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors pronounced him dead. The cause of death was a massive heart attack, likely brought on by years of drug abuse, heavy smoking, and physical deterioration. There were no mourners, no tributes, no grieving family members. His body went unclaimed for days, until it was quietly cremated. The ashes, like the man himself, were discarded without ceremony. But Speck's death would not bring peace. The true nature of his final years was still largely unknown, until 1996, when the infamous smuggled prison tapes surfaced, though recorded in 1988. They remained hidden for nearly 8 years, an open secret among inmates and corrupt guards, but a total shock to the outside world when they finally came to light. The footage shattered whatever illusion the public may have had about the punishment Speck endured. On national television, Americans watched in stunned silence as the footage played. Richard Speck, wearing silk panties, giggling in a drug-induced haze, fondling his surgically developed breasts, and boasting about the murders. If they knew how much fun I was having, he slurred at one point, they'd turn this place into a death house again. To say the country was outraged would be an understatement. Parents of the victims, now elderly, wept openly during interviews. They had spent decades believing the man who destroyed their families was rotting in a cold cell, filled with remorse. Instead, they learned he had been taking hormones, having sex, snorting cocaine, and mocking the justice system with smug satisfaction. The tapes launched immediate investigations into the Illinois Department of Corrections. How could this have happened? How had a high-profile mass murderer acquired drugs, hormone therapy, video equipment, and even access to other inmates for sexual activities? It was a damning indictment of prison oversight and corruption. Politicians, facing mounting public pressure, promised reform. The tapes were used in congressional hearings as evidence of the dire need for prison system accountability, but beyond institutional embarrassment, the tapes did something far more unsettling. They reshaped Speck's legacy. For decades, he had been viewed as a symbol of unchecked rage, a misogynistic monster who slaughtered innocent women in a single night of madness. But the videos revealed something darker, more grotesque. He wasn't just a killer, he was a sociopath who thrived on attention, chaos, and power. He had not only failed to repent, he had transformed into a carnival of depravity. Flaunting his perverse reinvention with disturbing glee, psychologists and criminologists pored over the tapes, seeking clues into Speck's psyche. Some saw his gender transformation and exhibitionism as forms of self-protection survival tactics in a violent environment. Others believed it was a continuation of his narcissism and manipulation. Richard Speck wasn't trying to become someone new, one expert said. He was simply shedding whatever mask no longer served him. For the LGBTQ community, the tapes presented a difficult and deeply controversial challenge. Some activists were quick to clarify Speck was not representative of any transgender identity. He had not come out, nor had he sought recognition for a transition. His behavior was driven by survival, power dynamics, and psychological instability, not a genuine gender identity. Still, tabloids ran wild with headlines like "Trans Killer Tapes" and "Monster in Makeup," further stigmatizing an already misunderstood community. In the aftermath of the video scandal, laws were proposed to increase restrictions on inmate privileges, surveillance, and contraband in correctional facilities. But the deeper issue remained. The American prison system had not only failed to punish Richard Speck, it had allowed him to evolve into something even more disturbing. In death, Speck achieved a form of immortality, not as a cautionary tale of justice served, but as a grotesque symbol of its failure. Documentaries, books, and news specials continued to revisit his case, not just to explore the murders, but to dissect what came after the years of indulgence, the horrifying tapes, the transformation that defied logic and decency. For the families of the victims, his death was hollow. The closure they had longed for was tarnished by the knowledge of how Speck had lived. "He died too easy," said one relative during a televised interview. "He died laughing. That's not justice." Today, Richard Speck remains one of the most reviled figures in American true crime. Not because he killed 8 women in one night, that alone would have sealed his infamy, but because even in prison, he found a way to manipulate, provoke, and disgust a nation. In a system designed to strip men like him of power, Richard Speck found a way to take it back, and that, perhaps, is his most disturbing legacy of all.